In 1942, during construction work to expand a municipal water facility in eastern Baghdad, Iraqi engineering crews broke through into an underground chamber that had no business existing, where their blueprints indicated only packed riverbed sediment. The chamber was sealed. Its walls were composed of fired brick, arranged in patterns consistent with Abbasid-era construction, yet the depth and location placed it far below any known medieval foundation. When crews attempted to measure the full extent of the space using plumb lines and lanterns, they reported that the chamber extended in multiple directions, that the air inside carried a faint mineral odor, and that at least one passage descended at a steep angle toward what they believed might be older construction. Within 72 hours, the excavation was halted. Official records from the Ministry of Public Works noted structural instability and the danger of groundwater flooding. The opening was sealed with concrete. The construction plans were revised, and the incident was largely forgotten, outside a small circle of municipal engineers and local historians. But that was not the only time something had been found beneath Baghdad. Decades earlier, British engineers working on irrigation projects near the Tigris had documented anomalies in subsurface geology that suggested the presence of voids, chambers, and possibly tunnels beneath sections of the old city. And centuries before that, Arab geographers had recorded traditions claiming that Baghdad had been built atop older cities, and that some of those older cities had never been fully abandoned. Were the chambers discovered in 1942 part of a forgotten medieval infrastructure? Or had the engineers stumbled onto something far older, something that predated the Abbasid capital itself? To answer that, we must begin with the city's origins and the landscape it was built upon. Baghdad was founded in 762 CE by the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur on the western bank of the Tigris River. It was a planned city designed as a perfect circle, with the Caliph's palace and the Grand Mosque at its center. Within decades, it became the largest and most prosperous city in the world, a hub of trade, scholarship, and administration. But Al-Mansur did not choose the location arbitrarily. The site had been occupied for centuries before the Abbasids arrived. Archaeological surveys have identified Sasanian Persian structures, earlier Parthian construction, and even older settlement layers extending back to Babylonian and Sumerian periods. The Tigris River Valley had been continuously inhabited for more than 4,000 years, and each successive civilization built upon the ruins of the last. Medieval Arab historians understood this. Al-Tabari, writing in the 9th century, noted that Al-Mansur consulted engineers and astrologers before selecting the site. Al-Yaqubi mentioned that the area contained old Persian settlements and canals. Later geographers, including Al-Masudi and Yaqut al-Hamawi, repeated traditions that portions of the city overlay older foundations, some of which were accessible through underground passages. These were not presented as legends. They were recorded as matters of practical geography and urban history. Yet over the centuries, as the city expanded, contracted, and was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, most catastrophically during the Mongol sack of 1258, knowledge of what lay beneath the surface became fragmented. By the 20th century, when modern infrastructure projects required deep excavation, there was little institutional memory of what might be found. The 1942 discovery occurred in the neighborhood of Rusafa, on the eastern bank of the Tigris. The area had been part of medieval Baghdad's expansion under Harun al-Rashid, who built a second palace complex there in the late 8th century. The waterworks project was routine. Engineers were installing underground pipes to connect a new filtration station with the municipal grid. The excavation reached approximately 9 meters below street level when the drill rig punched through into empty space. The initial assumption was that they had struck an old cistern or sewer line, but when workers widened the opening and descended with lamps, they found a vaulted chamber approximately 4 meters high and at least 6 meters across. The walls were composed of baked brick laid in alternating courses, a technique common in Abbasid architecture, but also used in earlier Sasanian construction. The floor was paved with stone slabs. There were no visible inscriptions. What troubled the engineers was not the chamber itself, but what lay beyond it. At the far end of the room, they found an archway leading into a corridor. The corridor sloped downward. They followed it for approximately 20 meters before reaching a junction where it split into 2 passages. One appeared to continue descending. The other turned sharply and disappeared into darkness. The air was cool and dry, which suggested ventilation from another source. That implied the existence of additional openings, possibly to the surface, possibly to the river, or possibly to other subterranean structures. The crew marked the location and withdrew. A senior engineer from the Ministry of Public Works was summoned to inspect the site. His report, portions of which were later referenced in municipal archives, recommended immediate cessation of work. He cited risk of structural collapse, potential flooding from the nearby river, and the possibility of disturbing burial sites or historically sensitive structures. The chamber was sealed, the water line was rerouted, and the project continued. But the story did not end there. In the years following the discovery, at least 3 other construction projects in central Baghdad reported similar encounters. In 1949, workers excavating a foundation for a government building near Bab al-Muaddam broke into what they described as a long, narrow tunnel running parallel to the old city wall. The tunnel was brick-lined and appeared deliberate in design, not a natural cavity or collapsed sewer. In 1958, during street repairs in the Kark district, crews uncovered a stone-lined shaft that descended more than 12 meters before reaching what appeared to be a chamber or passageway below. In 1966, construction of a new bridge abutment on the western bank exposed a section of vaulted brick ceiling approximately 7 meters beneath the riverbed. Each time, the response was similar. The opening was documented, sometimes photographed, then sealed. Official explanations referenced flood risk, structural danger, and the impracticality of archaeological excavation during active construction. None of the sites were systematically explored. What made these discoveries more intriguing was their distribution. The locations were not clustered in one neighborhood. They were scattered across both banks of the Tigris, spanning a distance of more than 5 kilometers. The depths varied, but all were significantly below the level of known medieval foundations. The construction techniques were consistent: fired brick, stone paving, vaulted arches, but without inscriptions or datable artifacts. Precise chronology was impossible to establish. Some archaeologists suggested the structures were part of Baghdad's medieval sewer and water management system, which was known to be extensive and sophisticated. Others pointed out that the depth, orientation, and scale of some of the chambers did not match typical hydraulic engineering. Several passages appeared to slope downward, rather than following the natural drainage gradient toward the river. And none of the medieval historical texts that described Baghdad's infrastructure mentioned tunnels of this type or scale. The question of what the chambers were intended for remained unresolved. But the pattern of official response raised another question. Why were none of these sites properly excavated? Iraq had a well-established Department of Antiquities. Baghdad itself was home to the Iraq Museum and a community of trained archaeologists and historians. Yet in each documented case, the decision was made to seal the structure rather than investigate it. Some explanations are practical. Mid-20th century Iraq was undergoing rapid modernization. Infrastructure projects operated under tight deadlines and budgets. Delays for archaeological surveys were costly. Excavating deep subterranean structures in an urban environment posed genuine safety risks, particularly in areas with high water tables or unstable soil. Flooding from the Tigris was a recurring threat, and breaching sealed underground chambers could compromise the foundations of buildings above. But there were other factors. Iraq's archaeological resources were already stretched thin. The country contained thousands of ancient sites, many far more significant than unidentified brick chambers beneath a modern city. Priorities had to be set, and anonymous subterranean structures were not considered urgent. There was also the issue of ownership and jurisdiction. Discoveries made during municipal construction projects fell into a gray area between the Ministry of Public Works and the Department of Antiquities. Bureaucratic coordination was slow, and by the time decisions were made, construction schedules had moved on. Additionally, there were concerns about looting. Any publicized discovery of accessible underground chambers would attract treasure hunters and illegal excavators, particularly in periods of political instability. It was often considered safer to seal a site than to leave it exposed. Yet, despite these explanations, the absence of any detailed investigation remains striking. Not a single one of these chambers was fully mapped. Not a single artifact was recovered and catalogued. Not a single photograph of the interiors was published in an academic journal. The documentation that does exist is fragmentary, consisting mostly of brief mentions in administrative reports, references in newspaper articles, and second-hand accounts from engineers and construction workers. By the time international archaeologists became aware of the discoveries, the sites had already been sealed and built over. The opportunity to study them had passed. It is here that the historical record intersects with something older. Long before the 1942 discovery, Baghdad's underground geography had been part of local knowledge and oral tradition. Residents of certain neighborhoods spoke of old cellars that connected to tunnels, of wells that opened into chambers, of stories passed down from grandparents about hidden rooms beneath the city. These accounts were rarely written down, and when they were dismissed as folklore. But some of the details were remarkably specific. Families living near the old Mustansiriya Madrasa, a 13th-century educational complex, reported that the building's lower levels contained sealed doorways leading to passages that predated the structure. Residents near the ruins of the Abbasid Palace complex claimed that certain courtyards had been built over older foundations, and that during heavy rains, sinkholes occasionally opened to reveal brick-lined voids below. One account, recorded in the 1930s by a British archaeologist working in Baghdad, described an interview with an elderly builder whose family had worked in the city for generations. The man claimed that his grandfather had been hired in the late 19th century to repair a collapsed section of floor in a merchant's house near the Sharjah market. When they removed the debris, they found a stone staircase descending into darkness. The family descended with lamps and found a large rectangular room with walls covered in decorative plasterwork. The room connected to a passage that extended in the direction of the river. They explored only a short distance before the air became stale, and they turned back. The merchant ordered the staircase filled with rubble and the floor rebuilt. The archaeologist noted the account, but could not verify it. The house had been demolished years earlier, and the merchant's family had moved away. These traditions cannot be treated as historical proof. Memory distorts over generations. Stories are embellished, details are confused, but when placed beside the physical discoveries made during construction projects, a pattern begins to emerge. The chambers were real, the passages were real, the depth and construction quality were real. The question was not whether something existed beneath Baghdad, but what it was when it was built and for what purpose. Medieval hydraulic infrastructure could account for some of it. Baghdad's water supply system included underground canals, cisterns, and drainage channels, some of which were engineered with remarkable sophistication. The Narawan Canal, which supplied water to the city from the Diyala River, included subterranean sections designed to regulate flow and prevent evaporation. But the reported depths and configurations of the chambers discovered in the 20th century did not always match known hydraulic patterns. Another possibility involves older construction. The site of Baghdad had been occupied continuously for millennia. Sasanian Persians, who controlled the region before the Islamic conquest, were accomplished builders. They constructed elaborate underground water systems called qanats, which used gravity-fed tunnels to transport water across long distances. Some qanats were large enough to walk through. The Parthians before them also built subterranean structures, including storage chambers and defensive tunnels. Further back, Babylonian and Assyrian civilizations engineered underground passages for water management, storage, and possibly ceremonial purposes. It is entirely plausible that some of the chambers discovered in modern Baghdad were remnants of these earlier periods, incorporated into later construction, or simply buried and forgotten as the city grew upward. But this explanation raises its own questions. If the structures were ancient, why were they not documented by medieval Arab historians who wrote extensively about Baghdad's construction? If they were part of the Abbasid city's infrastructure, why were they built so deep, and why do they not appear in contemporary engineering records? And if they were simply old qanats or cisterns, why did Iraqi engineers in the 1940s and 1950s consider them dangerous or sensitive enough to seal rather than incorporate into modern utility systems? The answer may lie in a combination of factors. Some structures may indeed have been ancient and unknown to medieval builders. Others may have been known but considered unimportant or unsafe. Still others may have been deliberately sealed for reasons that were not recorded, or were recorded in documents that no longer survive. The most detailed account of the 1942 chamber comes from an unpublished memoir written decades later by one of the engineers who had been present during the discovery. He described the interior as remarkably well preserved, with no significant water damage despite its proximity to the river. He noted that the brickwork showed signs of repair in at least 2 distinct periods, suggesting the chamber had been maintained and reused over time. He also mentioned that the descending passage they briefly explored appeared to widen further down, and that faint markings on the walls might have been inscriptions, though the light was too poor to read them clearly. He did not understand why the decision was made to seal the site so quickly, but he accepted the explanation of structural danger. Years later, he wondered whether that explanation had been entirely truthful. Modern archaeology has confirmed that Baghdad sits atop a complex archaeological palimpsest. Limited excavations conducted in the latter half of the 20th century, particularly in areas damaged during the Iraq War, have revealed multiple occupation layers extending back to pre-Islamic periods. Fragments of Sasanian pottery, Parthian coins, and even older Mesopotamian artifacts have been recovered from depths consistent with the chambers discovered during construction. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1980s detected anomalies beneath several districts of the old city, including linear features that could represent walls, tunnels, or channels. However, political instability, conflict, and lack of funding have prevented comprehensive archaeological investigation. Most of what lies beneath Baghdad remains undisturbed and undocumented. Each source preserves part of the story. The engineering reports confirm that sealed chambers exist at significant depth. The oral tradition suggests that knowledge of these spaces persisted in local memory long after official records were lost. The medieval histories indicate that Baghdad was deliberately built over older sites, and that subterranean infrastructure was both extensive and important. The archaeological evidence demonstrates continuous occupation and construction over thousands of years. But none of these sources, taken alone or together, provides a complete explanation. We know that something is there. We know that it was discovered multiple times. We know that it was sealed. What we do not know is the full extent of what lies beneath the city, how old it is, or why successive authorities chose not to investigate it fully. Perhaps future archaeological projects, conducted under stable conditions with modern technology, will finally map the subterranean layers of Baghdad. Perhaps ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, or non-invasive imaging techniques will reveal the layout of the chambers and tunnels without requiring destructive excavation. Or perhaps the evidence has already been damaged beyond recovery by a century of construction, conflict, and urban expansion. What remains certain is that beneath one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities lies a hidden geography that was briefly glimpsed and then deliberately obscured. The engineers who broke through in 1942 touched the edge of something far larger than a single room. They found a passage that led deeper, a system that extended farther, and a mystery that no one was permitted to solve. Why did Iraqi engineers refuse to excavate further? Thank you for watching. If you're fascinated by forgotten history uncovered through original records, archaeological mysteries, and the hidden layers beneath ancient cities, subscribe for more documentaries that investigate what lies just beyond the reach of official history. Do you believe the sealed chambers were simply part of medieval infrastructure that was considered too dangerous to explore? Or do you think the rapid decision to seal them suggests they contained something authorities preferred to leave undisturbed? Share your interpretation in the comments below.